Welcome to Uncertain Things. This is a very sick and flu-ridden Adam. Vanessa is out there tending to her 1-year-old. In her stead, I'm joined by James Lindsay, founder and author of New Discourses. Any other title that I should attribute?
I mean, a lot of people know my book, Cynical Theories, which is in a bunch of languages, like 30-something languages, and has sold something like 500,000 copies.
And highly recommended. James, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So as I told you in the proverbial green room, I think that our audience, being exceptionally diverse, half of them probably pays close attention to your work and commentary, long and short form, while the other half might be being introduced to you for the first time. So could you give us a bit of a background of how you turned from the realm of academia into more, let's say, heated political discourse?
Yeah, I can tell my story. It doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people till you kind of hear it, but I'm trained as a mathematician. My bachelor's degree is in physics. My master's and PhD are in mathematics. I did not stay in academia. I had no desire to stay in academia by the time I finished my PhD. I had hit my limit. It wasn't that I saw the universities going woke or any of this. I just hit my limit with academic bureaucracy. I didn't want to work in such a bureaucratic environment. I didn't want to go through the cycles necessary to continue an academic career, which is like a postdoc, and then maybe you get a tenure track, maybe do another postdoc, and then finally get a tenure track. And it's basically like you're just redoing your PhD over and over and over again, which is an unpleasant process for sort of 7 to 10 years. And I thought, why the hell do I want to keep doing this? Wasn't interested, didn't like working there, saw this emphasis that is now kind of hot news at the time, which was a veering toward an emphasis on student retention, keeping the tuition dollars flowing, which means in the current discussion, grade inflation. Just pass people, make sure they keep their scholarships, keep their morale up. I didn't want to be a part of that. I've always thought education should be kind of hard ass. If you fail, you fail. If you fail out, goodbye. Like that kind of attitude. And like, I've always sort of had that. So it's not this mollycoddle participation trophy bachelor's degree mentality that kind of captured our society. So I didn't want to participate.
Can I ask you about that? Just, I'm actually interested. When did you notice the grade inflation phenomena?
It started to become a real problem, in my opinion. It was probably a problem before this, but it became a tangible problem in 2007 and 2008, that academic year, because that was the first academic year where we were specifically being instructed not to fail too many students in anything below calculus. So if it was kind of one of these, what universities call a service course, something that you take outside of your major, but you have to take it, general curriculum requirements require them, make sure you don't fail too many people. And calculus and up, I think the rules stayed the same, but I thought, okay, it was like find excuses to give people extra credit. Don't hurt their morale, don't lose their scholarships. And I thought, whatever this is about, I don't like it. There are some guesses I had about how much mortgage debt universities were in. I wasn't very happy about watching how quickly every university that I was aware of was growing. Brand new dorms, brand new buildings with high-tech equipment, brand new fitness centers, entertainment centers like bowling alleys and stuff being built on campus, even movie theaters in some cases. And I noticed, even when I went to college in the 90s, I noticed that colleges had begun to compete on student services rather than on academics. And I thought, this is not something that I'm enjoying, and I kind of want to get out. So I did not aim to continue my academic career.
Not to stay on this for too long, but this actually fascinates me because the state of academia as a shifting business model is something that fascinates me. And I think that trying to disentangle this is actually important to any meaningful, university or higher ed reform. Do you think that the I mean, clearly you were suggesting that, but how radically has the fundamental business model of universities changed over the past 50 years to your understanding?
Completely. And I would actually shorten the time frame to 30 years, not 50. In fact, we can date it to when the federal government got directly involved in the student loan business, because that's where all of a sudden everybody who wanted a student loan could have one. And the federal government would underwrite it, but then you couldn't default on it. And it created this weird situation. And this is when all of a sudden universities realized that a very large number of students who before that would have struggled to come to college or going to be able to come to college because student loans became massively accessible. Well, I don't know how much time you spent around 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds who are planning to go to college, but I still remember my tender days at the end of my high school experience. And it was very, very clear how almost all of my friends at the time, this being in the late 90s, so Clinton would have put that student loan deal in the middle of the 90s, so a few years earlier. But it's very clear, and this has nothing to do with the federal government, what the average 17-year-old was looking for in a college. Good social life, good parties, good football, things to do. And you start to hear about these college campuses. I remember like going and touring colleges and looking at the dorms and thinking, ugh. And then I went to this one kind of, very kind of elite college in the Southeast. And I mean, maybe it's not that elite, but it considers itself very elite, and it's kind of remote and it's small and it's very kind of insular. It's called Sewanee. It's pretty far off the beaten track. And I thought to myself that it was kind of like a commune, and I wasn't really into it. They didn't have that much going on. So you were very involved in, student and academic life. When you're 17 shopping for a college and one of the colleges says, we have state-of-the-art dorms, everybody gets their own shower, people live in suites with small kitchens in each room, and you get to have, access to our $20 million fitness center. We have all these Olympic-sized swimming pools people can go swim in. You have all these different, we have a rock climbing wall. We have all this other crap. When you're 17, you're like, that place sounds fun. That place sounds cool. And honestly, you barely give a crap about the quality of the academic department that you're trying to get into. In fact, you might not even be aware of whether or not it's a good school. Maybe 10% of high school students give a single shit about how good the school is in terms of its academics. So all of a sudden, you have this access point to huge amounts of money for students who are not trying to get in on academic scholarships or who are not working their way through college in order to try to get a leg up. It's just on this kind of mythology. Everybody needs to go to college in order to get a good job, to avoid the dreaded working class. And so the schools started to respond to this new reservoir of money by taking out gigantic mortgages to build the things that actually attract 17-year-olds to go to college there, which is not a better physics department, and it's not a harder math department, and it's not, top of the line academic professionals teaching. It's the bowling alley. It's these $50 or $100 million dorm complexes that they build so that every student doesn't have to share one bathroom per floor and figure it out, which is what we actually had to do at the school I went to. The academic game before that, the business before that, was to provide the academic experience that would attract the students that were trying to work their way up. And it became after that, how do we attract students? Because they're rolling in on, state scholarship money. A lot of that's connected to the state lotteries. They're rolling in on this student loan money. There was no limit to what that could be. So if they build all this expensive stuff to compete on student services to try to bring kids in who are interested in student services and student life experiences as their main decision point, then all they have to do is raise tuition, and who cares? Because anybody can go get another student loan. So this is where you end up starting to get the huge amount of bad incentives that are trying to drag students in. They're competing on student services. They're building out administration to mollycoddle all these kids and to manage all of these affairs for all the kids that are coming into the school. And it doesn't matter how much it costs. And so tuition ends up growing at something like 8 times the rate of inflation, because It's just the ability for them to be able to go get this money, just go get another loan. And then we back ourselves into this, or paint ourselves into this corner that we're in now, that your average college graduate is entering a largely saturated job market outside of certain professional specialties, saddled with $200,000 to $400,000 in student loan debt that they'll maybe never pay off, that they can't even declare bankruptcy on and default out of, with absolutely no liability for the universities that got them there, which attracted them and tried to keep them through a bunch of means that had nothing to do with preparing them academically for the professional world.
Right, because if anything, everything that you're describing is almost in conflicting alignment with academic rigor and standards, because any standards means winnowing or calling the herd a little bit.
Yeah, and once you change the standard or the idea,
you said, discouraging the students to some extent.
That's right. The idea is no longer the guys who want to go into some professional field like engineering or medicine or whatever go off to college. It's now everybody goes to college, and so the vast majority of the people who are coming to college no longer care about the quality of the academic experience that they're pursuing, because that's not why they're going in the first place. It's just the next thing you do when you're finished with high school. You go to college. It's just the next thing. So there's no logic. There's no trajectory. There's no vision. There's no design to why you're going to college. You're just going to college because that's what you do next. That's what your parents want you to do. There are very simple reasons. And for good or for ill, 17-year-olds don't generally make all the best decisions all the time in life. And so they're attracted to the things that they're attracted to, that is, we would expect an immature 17-year-old to be attracted to. And there are some mature ones. I'm not putting every 17-year-old down, but the ones that are there for very strong professional reasons, do care about the academics. They pick this university versus that university because it has a better XYZ program. But the majority of the students going don't care. So what's happened is the entire incentive structure around the business of academia changed completely by the federal government making it so that there's, in effect, an infinite reservoir of student loan money that can flow into the hands of students to pay their tuition. And the universities responded by competing to attract students and to retain students. And in so doing, regardless of academics, by the way, and in so doing, they started to build things that put them under massive amounts of loan debt, mortgage debt. You buy $100 million new business building or $100 million dorm complex or something like that, or four of them, you've got a problem. And at one point, I don't know the stats on this, I didn't look them up myself, but my brother was working in a university some years ago, about a little over a decade ago. And he told me, and again, this is hearsay, but he told me that at the time there were exactly 2 universities in the United States that were operating in the black out of all, whatever it is, 15,000 universities or whatever we have in the United States. 2 of them were in the black. All the rest were in the red. Every other one loses money. Doesn't matter how much they bring in through their tuition. Doesn't matter how much they bring in through this. And it's almost, I was like, well, what is it? And he's like, it's almost all mortgage debt. They owe huge amounts of money for the student services that they've built out.
Just anecdotally, if you walk in Manhattan over, 90th Street, even probably even 80th Street, you're starting to see that larger and larger chunk of the streets is just taken over by Columbia University. And if you go under, let's say, 19th Street, you see that more and more of the streets is constantly being encroached upon by NYU, somewhat with a new school, but more so NYU. And it's really starting to feel like a real estate racket.
Yeah, well, it probably is. But listen, because if you have this debt, you have 2 things you have to do. You have to attract more money. But then secondly, there's student retention. And this is kind of the untold story. This is where I encountered it with if you're below a certain line. So I don't want to give this impression that every math class, because it was the math department, was being grade inflated or made squishy or whatever. It was below a certain line. In particular, if you're in a service level course, meaning this course actually doesn't mean anything to the degree that the student is pursuing, then go ahead and just push them through. The second thing it actually does is it's not just the grade inflation. There's a big question is in the 2010s and maybe 2005 to 2020 is how in the hell did our universities go so far left, right? And people talk about the professorate, being self-selecting and all of this crap, but it doesn't explain why everything administratively went so far left. And the administrations went left partly because they draw off of the same educated pools, but more so because you have this small group of basically inconsolable students who are very far left activist types. Everything's a crisis for them. It's a feminist crisis. It's a race crisis. It's some kind of crisis on some social issue. And if you're terrified to lose that most inconsolable 2% of your student population, if you're terrified that they're going to make a gigantic PR stink about you that's going to threaten your recruitment abilities, all of a sudden you start building out administrative apparatuses that will protect and console them and make them happy, like DEI apparatuses in particular. You start building out offices that have punitive force in order to maintain campus diversity or whatever. And that thing just becomes a sprawling monster because the problems are endless, and what you're actually catering to are activists who are making demands, who are constantly trying to change the social environment even more than they already have until it's some utopian place, which it'll never be, especially not with a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds.
Do you see the activism? Do you see the activism as basically predating the entry into university? Do you think they come in, the average student comes in with some notional high school ideas about social justice and then imposes it on the university, and the university, being captured by their customers, accommodate? Or do they come in seeking fun, trying to hang out in universities and colleges, and then because the culture in that college also promotes and perpetuates certain very specific social ideas, then that becomes part of the activity of being in college, part of the, the way I was thinking about this and talking to, I teach at Yeshiva University, and I taught a class about how to try to, just sociological analysis. And I used higher ed as an example and try to explain what is going on in social ed. You understand that the incentive to go to universities, or at least to colleges, by many students clearly is not the academic rigor, and the amount of time spent protesting is indicative that the academic work itself is not the top priority for so many students. But is it about actual social justice? Is it about true moral, righteous views about the world, tikkun olam, or is it just what you do? This is how you become accepted. This is how you're either cool, are you enjoy the cool crowd, or you become, part of the elite. Because after all, the colleges are about inculcating the new, or at least the idea of this is how you get your elite membership card, right? So you get your elite membership card by going to college and doing what the other cool kids are doing, which is protesting.
Yeah, I think that has been an evolving story. When I went to college, it certainly just wasn't a thing that was happening, and that was late 90s. It just wasn't happening. Maybe at the elite certainly at the elite universities, Columbia and so on, probably would have had it, but you wouldn't have seen it at a state university like I went to. Nobody did it. Coming later, I think that the incubation point was actually the professorate and their kind of different student groups that they would put together, creating these kind of enclaves on campus that grew in their popularity as campus lurched further left. But I've distinctly heard that by the middle 2010s, it was no longer being led by the professors or even the administration as it existed. It was being led by high school students that were coming in with pre-existing notions. So something had changed by the middle part of the 2010s, but probably not earlier, to where high school students started to pick this stuff up before they got to college. If you want my guess as to what it is that changed, is social media. Social media, if you want my best guess as to what the dynamic was, is that these people that were into, say, feminism or third wave radical feminism, as it got called all through the late 2010s and the early 2010s, really is this major vehicle to this leftism on campuses. And these people took advantage of a new social media technology at the time that most people were not taking as full advantage of, which was blogging and blogging networks. And my guess is that became like a feeder stream to get articles in kind of feminine coded, primarily teen oriented magazines, things like Red Teen, Cosmopolitan Teen, whatever these things are called. What is it? The big one that gets in trouble, Teen Vogue. So this became like a feeder ground to get articles into those kinds of magazines. And I think that the Gamergate scandal kind of shows that even in gaming magazines, that was kind of a thing that was happening at the time. And so these kids are starting to pick this stuff up from the stuff they're reading in their magazines. They're following up on the authors online, reading their blogs. And so it doesn't start off with the high schools indoctrinating students into social justice ideology at all. It's that they're picking it up in their online social universe, which we didn't have. That didn't exist meaningfully before 2011. There was a little bit of Facebooking happening before 2010, 2011, but pretty much this is a 2010 to 2012 phenomenon that it's really emerging as a thing that younger people are doing a lot. High school age people are doing a lot. Facebook was just opening up a few years before that to the general public. It was a very different environment than we'd ever been in before. And I think that actually brought the ideas into the high schools, which then followed, again, the same thing. You have these small numbers, relatively speaking, small proportion of students who are being brought into the radical ideologies, who have a very outsized voice. And then you just kind of start to see this thing snowball. And by the middle of the 2010s, the dynamic that you described is happening. It's the cool thing to do. It's what everybody's doing. If you're not doing it, you're probably a problem. You're contributing to a toxic culture. It's getting reinforced by this increasingly leftward bent professorate and this increasing administration that's being brought in to maintain the peace or try to keep this thing together when you have more and more kind of, like I said, inconsolable activist type students. And so I think that the campus story is very complicated, but somewhere down in the root of it is this whole thing where they have access to basically infinite money, decided to attract people on the wrong vectors, and then painted themselves into a financial corner that required them to build out these apparatuses, which then cost more, et cetera, et cetera. While socially on campus, you have this dynamic where it starts with the feminist professors and their handful of students. Those people primarily take it online, discussion boards and blogs. That starts to bring in some people on campus, but I think it probably primarily affects the next generation coming up, reading that kind of stuff on social media, which they were new to. We all were new to. And so you can get the engine running. Then that becomes this kind of accelerating process. These blog-induced kids come off to college. They want to learn more about those things. They focus on those things. They create activist groups on campus. Next thing you know, if you want to fit in, that's how you act. And then you have this whole spate for 6-8 years in the middle of the 2010s, where if you had the wrong opinions on campus, you probably would get absolutely nuked or get thrown out of school. All these high profile cases, all these, protesting of totally reasonable sometimes and totally unreasonable at other times, conservative speakers who'd be brought to campus, sometimes as an actual speech, sometimes as some kind of a weird spectacle, performance thing, thinking of characters like Milo Yiannopoulos getting dragged around to do what he called, and I know I would get in trouble for even saying this, but it's what he actually called it. He called his tour the Dangerous Faggot Tour and went around and just pissed people off on college campuses on purpose, bragging that he was using the marketing strategy that was written down in the book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, in order to get people to come and throw a fit, to get more attention on himself, to get more explosion in this social media fueled culture war that couldn't exist before that.
It was a beautiful codependency between the hysteria on campuses and the people who knew how to exploit it into their own business.
That's what that book is about. I don't know. A lot of people haven't read it. It's called Trust Me, I'm Lying. It's about them making a movie, and they didn't have a marketing budget, and they knew that the movie would kind of aggravate feminists, some campus, stupid movie that they made, and they knew it would aggravate feminists. So they'd go to college campuses and they put up flyers about them. And then what they actually did was they came and vandalized their own flyers and billboards overnight. And then they made a news story about how their stuff got vandalized. That would cause the feminist blog circuit to write about how terrible it must be, the movie. So then everybody wanted to go see it. it to find out what the scandal was about. And they end up on this shoestring marketing budget, making crazy amounts of money. But what it was is this kind of viral marketing campaign, is like a negative marketing campaign, where what they would do is basically Juicy Smollett themselves by putting out materials, then destroying their own materials, and then turning that into a news story. So the goal became to create as much outrage as you can. It's this kind of like outrage-driven pyro marketing scheme. And the authors of the book claim that they weren't trying to teach people how to do it, but rather to tell people that it works. So we should all watch out for it, which might be true. I don't know. But I mean, I remember being maybe 2016, 15, something like that, this rather odious character of Milo Yiannopoulos saying that I never had heard of the book. I picked up that the book exists because he said it was his marketing strategy.
That's so wild. It's so wild how people are open about their cynicism, and it still works. So you are in academia, and the thing that is bothering you is the sense that there's a dilution of academic rigor, and that you're worried about the general trajectory of an academic career. So you leave.
Yeah. So I leave. And like I said, I just really want to stress, it's such a bureaucratic nightmare. I just don't want to work in a bureaucracy. I've never wanted to work in a bureaucratic nightmare bureaucracy. So anyway, I leave. And so people never believe this, or if they do, they make fun of me. I actually, for a variety of reasons, became a massage therapist, and I actually treated chronic pain for a decade. Through the entire of 2010 to 2020, I was a licensed massage therapist, and I treated specifically chronic pain and sports injuries because I had one, and I was able to use these techniques for myself in 2007, 2008 to fix myself. I didn't want to continue in academia. I didn't want to I was offered a job teaching high school, but I would have had to go back to school for another year to get a certification, and I would have to teach physics, not math. So I was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to deal with 14-year-olds learning physics at 7 in the freaking morning and have to go to college another year to do it. So I didn't want to do that. So I was like, all right, I'll just, get into this massage thing and like help people. And I did for, a decade, but that gave me free time and latitude to stay kind of involved in this sort of philosophy of science, kind of social culture war conversation that I had become interested in. I started writing, started working. Eventually in 2013, I met Peter Boghossian online, and we started writing together. He was at Portland State University, so the culture war was banging on his door, like kind of literally banging on his door. Sometimes the diversity office would show up. He'd been accused of something. They had an anonymous reporting system. So if he did some, event and he hosted a conservative speaker at Portland State, as he had a tendency to do, because he wasn't even a conservative. He, in fact, was a progressive, but he thought it was interesting to have the debate and the dialogue. So he'd bring these people he thought were interesting. He'd try to talk to them. Sometimes they'd be Christian apologists. Sometimes it'd be whatever. And it was a virtual guarantee that after he'd host one of these, he'd get a rash of anonymous tips submitted to the diversity office that he was like a wife beater or some other crazy stuff. And so
the tattletale direct line.
Yeah, that's right. And so he got harangued by that. So this became very kind of real and palpable. And we started paying attention to it. And we started paying attention to the actual academic literature and gender studies and feminism and so on. And just not in a very engaged way, but like we were aware of it and paying attention to it. Peter was very involved. I was involved in the New Atheist movement. That's how I met him. He was very involved. The conferences there were in like utter meltdown by that point because the feminists were accusing everybody of sexual impropriety at every possible turn. The race stuff was revving up. All the social justice, they call it Atheism Plus, which stood for Atheism Plus Social Justice, was like becoming this huge phenomenon. It sucked. It was no fun for anybody. So we were paying attention to it. And one thing leads to another, us looking at the academic literature being both the one thing and the other. And eventually Peter and I decided the only way to deal with this is to write an academic hoax. And thus begins a new chapter in my life rather profoundly. We write in early 2017, a hoax paper called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. I modeled it after a paper I saw in Gender and Society, which is the leading gender studies journal in the world, that was called Menstrual Blood as a Social Construct. So I just took that and transformed it to a different thing. And so we wrote this asinine paper about how the penis doesn't really exist, or it shouldn't be thought of as an organ so much as it should be as like a symbolic gesture that all men identify with. It causes them to be braggadocious and macho and all this annoying stuff. And it therefore leads to all the problems in the world, and in particular climate change. And we just crammed as much, varsity blues, teenage puerile humor as we could into this 3,500 word paper, made up citations. I mean, just went balls to the wall with this thing, submitted it to a masculinity studies journal that goes by the acronym NORMA, which I don't remember what it means, except that the M is masculinities. I have no idea what the rest of the letters stand for anymore. And they didn't want it. So they ask us, it's a Taylor and Francis journal, that's the publishing house, can we forward it to another sister journal in the Taylor and Francis, under the Taylor and Francis umbrella? And we said, yeah, sure, why not? We have nothing else to do with this stupid paper. It's so ridiculous, I don't think it's going to work. So I just said, yeah, sure, why not? So they forwarded off to this thing called Cogent Social Sciences. We never submitted it there. They forwarded it internally. Little did we know that we had actually uncovered a scandal here, because we have a legitimate, at least in terms of it being actually academically grounded, academic journal called Norma in the Taylor and Francis family that rejects a paper and offers to forward it to Cogent Social Sciences, which is a pay to publish, by all appearances, predatory academic journal, which of course then publishes it. Because they're a class act, they forgot to charge us. So we technically did not pay to have it published. It was part of the deal, but we never paid because they forgot. And then after the fact, they were like, please pay us. And we were like, no, we're not going to. And so we spiked the football. We said gender studies is obviously a huge problem, but we didn't have the clout in the journal that had published our paper to prove that. So we overspoke. We missed the actual scandal that we'd uncovered. Sort of embarrassing, but it was also sort of exciting. And we got told by a number of people in public venues that if we'd wished to prove our point, we would have had to use more journals, better papers, blah, blah, blah. So Peter and I got on the phone, decided that was in May of 2017. By June of 2017, we had decided to begin to do what they said would be required. And Peter and I ended up having a gentleman's bet. Pete wanted to put money on it, but I wouldn't take the money because I knew he was right. And why would I bet against him when I know he's going to win, right? But we had a gentleman's bet where I pretended to disagree with him, that if we do this and we succeed, not one single person will change their mind about whether or not what we did was adequate. So the same people who said what you did is inadequate will come out and say what you did is still inadequate. So that was the gentleman's bet. Turns out,
even if you follow,
even if we do high-ranking journals, lots of papers, blah, 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 they'll find new excuses. And that's exactly what happened. So this became called the Grievance Studies Affair. We spent the entirety of the fall and winter of 2017, late summer through actually the end October of 2018, writing papers for feminist studies journals, gender studies, critical race theory, education, critical pedagogy, technically journals, weird critical methodologies journals, all kinds of different stuff, sexuality studies journals, feminist social work journal. And we ended up getting a whole bunch of these papers published. 7 of them were accepted for publication. 7 more by the time we were done were still under peer review. When I say we were done, the correct way to say that is that we got caught. The Wall Street Journal started digging into one of the papers that had been accepted and published. And it was so stupid that the journalists behind the scenes could not believe that it was real. It turns out it was a college student writing for a conservative online magazine, not a professor, not any brain genius. Nope. A conservative college student in like her sophomore year figured out there's no way this paper about dog humping incidents can possibly be real.
That was the rape culture in dog parks.
Rape Culture in Dog Parks paper. That's right. Yeah. She's published in Gender, Place, and Culture, the leading journal of feminist geography. given an award for excellence in scholarship in their 25th anniversary year, even though it was completely ridiculous. And this college student sees through it and is like, there's no way that's real. And so she pushes on it and pushes on it and pushes on it, writing, I think she was writing for Campus Reform, but I always get that mixed up a little bit. It's one of those small little right-wing campus watchdogs.
Like College Fix.
It could have been the College Fix. It might have been Campus Reform. It's one of the three that were floating around in that space. Anyway, she gets her friend at the Wall Street Journal digging on it. Turns out people at the Wall Street Journal are real journalists, and they ask hard questions like, did you ever prove that the people that submitted this are real? And so the Academic Journal got on our case. We knew the jig was up. The Wall Street Journal ends up talking to us. And
that's after publication, though.
That was well after the publication.
Right.
Yeah. That was in the summer of 2018, and this was published, I think, in early May of 2018. So it was a couple months later. And so it snowballed really fast once that paper got published. It turns out that paper was a bit over the top. And so in October, on the 2nd of October, they published their expose, and our experiment came to a screeching halt at that point. And so
what was the excuses that people who decided to still not take that as a warning signal used to dismiss you?
Oh, yeah. No control group. So we didn't submit like legitimate papers. We didn't submit ridiculous papers to things like physics or chemistry journals. So there were no controls to see what other, like if we could trick other kinds of journals. There was, Peter actually got brought up on charges at his university and found guilty of failing to use proper ethics for human experimentation. The claim was that we had done an experiment on human subjects, namely the journal editors and peer reviewers, and that we had failed to give them, informed consent or whatever. The IRB got involved, that we had not told them that they were being experimented on before they participated in the experiment that we submitted to them. So they brought Peter up on formal ethics charges at the Portland State University for that, which was pretty hilarious. He actually got accused of 3 things. One was fabricating data, which we had done, but because we had no intention of keeping it in the literature at any point and had it in writing, in fact, in advance that we weren't going to, from emails we sent to each other, he got exonerated of that charge. And then a second charge was this ethics violation. He was found guilty for that.
Fabricated numbers in the article that you've submitted in the
the dog park numbers were just made up. We didn't examine the genitals of 10,000 dogs. There are not 10,000 dogs at the dog park. There's the same 10 people bring their dogs every day.
But beyond that, isn't the point to prove that a fraudulent article got published?
Yeah, they should be able to figure out that really insane or like some of the data. I have decided to be outside of the academic world early on. They should be able to detect fraud.
But not should they be able to? Isn't that their job? Isn't that the reason why we have historically academic publications, so that they will put the screws to your research?
Yes, so that was another accusation, that we took advantage of their
trusting nature
of their trust. Yeah. But Peter's third charge was that he had plagiarized Mein Kampf in order for us to rewrite a chapter of Mein Kampf as intersectional feminism. That got accepted by the Feminist Social Work Journal. And Pete pled guilty to that charge. Yes, I did plagiarize Mein Kampf, at which point the university dropped the charge immediately. Once he said, yes, in fact, I did, the university no longer, they wanted to get him out, fire him on a plagiarism charge. But then once he said, yes, I did, it proved that we had actually, in fact, plagiarized Mein Kampf and got it published somewhere. And so they dropped the charge, which I thought was hilarious.
I don't understand. So what, they did that just as a bullying technique to just scare him? What was the purpose of that?
Well, I think they wanted to get him in trouble for plagiarism, but then they realized what they were admitting, if that became part of the actual official report, was that we had succeeded in getting them to publish Mein Kampf, which, given how much we changed it to make it academically palatable so that it wouldn't set off, plagiarism detectors, there was a reasonable argument that we had changed. We didn't change it in spirit, but we had changed it certainly in the verbiage.
It reminds me of I don't remember if it was UPenn or Princeton, where the dean came out apologizing around 2020 about all the racial discrimination that the universities have been complicit in over recent years, to which the first Trump administration responded, "Oh, you admit that you were responsible for race discrimination. I guess we have to sue you now for civil rights violations."
Yeah, that's right. I guess we have to pull all your federal funding or whatever. So it was very much like that. But in the midst of this, we meant this to kind of prove a point and to show people that there's a problem in the peer review process within what we thought were these ideologically captured domains. Not all academia. We're very careful in how we wrote it up. And in the middle of it, we decided it wasn't we wanted to be funny, and it wasn't funny anymore because one of our papers was about education. And when we got the peer review back from that, the idea was to progressively stack a classroom, which we took straight from a news article. So I think it was Penn. It might have been Pitt, one or the other, one of the big Pennsylvania, famous universities. A professor had done a progressive stack in the classroom, which means that they ordered everybody in according to how much privilege they have. And if they had too much privilege, they had a harder time. They put them on the bad side of the curve or whatever. And if they had less privilege, if they were historically marginalized, they got advantages in the classroom that other people didn't have access to. And so they got in trouble for this. The university actually held this professor in 2016 or 17, whatever it was, to account. And Peter thought it was just genius. Let's argue that should be a thing all classrooms do. So we wrote this crazy paper saying, in fact, that with the really privileged kids, that we should be abusing them. We called it experiential reparations. So the original professor who tried that was unironic. That was completely unironic. And the universities opposed
thinking
it.
To apply progressive discrimination in classrooms.
That's right. And that got her in trouble, maybe even relieved of her duties. I don't remember what the consequences were. We could look it up. It happened in, I think, 2017, one of the Pennsylvania universities. And we just argued for it unironically. We're like, no, this is a great idea. And so we put forth this argument. We said that it overcomes white fragility. All this before the world knew what white fragility was, before Robin DiAngelo became famous. We found our paper. We were like, that's the basis for this. Let's go. And so we write this paper, and we actually advocate that the students who have the most privilege should have to experience reparations in the classroom, so that they should actually have to sit on the floor and be spoken over and be criticized and mocked and things like that. Never have their emails or questions answered. Have to listen and learn in silence was one of the things we kept saying. We kept saying, invite them to listen and learn in silence. It was always invite them. But we also said that we would do it with something called critically compassionate intellectualism, which was just the most academic sounding thing we could find with the words critical and compassion in them. So it didn't matter what it was. We just needed a plug and play for a section to say that we're not abusing people, right? And so the peer review comes back and says, we love the idea. Paper's not done. You need to edit it more, sharpen it up. But in particular, we're concerned about this critically compassionate intellectual stuff. You cannot use compassion because you threaten to recenter the needs of the privileged students over the oppressed by focusing on compassion.
No shit.
And I was like, holy shit, this ends in genocide. If you scapegoat people by their immutable characteristics, white or male or whatever, and you're supposed to punish them to get them to realize how they're bad for society. And then compassion is absolutely prohibited. They said we have to use something called the pedagogy of discomfort from this woman, Megan Bowler, which is in a book called Feeling Power from 98 or something, instead of critically compassionate intellectualism. And that book advocates that to teach people what privilege is really about, or what oppression really feels like, is that you intentionally make them uncomfortable about their state of privilege and leave them to sit in that discomfort until they come around on their own to understanding and becoming a social justice advocate. And I was like, this ends in genocide. So I went to my wife and asked my wife, I said, I think I have a head start. This was funny. We're going to do it for a year, 2 years or whatever, and then go back to regular life. I said, I think I need to quit my job and dedicate everything that I have to studying and exposing whatever the hell this so-called social justice movement is.
Oh, wow. So really, it's that moment that flips a switch in your head that turns it from, boy, there is a corner in academia that is entirely fraudulent and is a joke, and I'm going to mock it for a few months, to there are the seeds of totalitarianism growing in this country.
That's exactly right. And I said, okay, I just told my wife, I said, I feel like I have a head start. So I have an obligation to try to tell the world about it. with Helen Pluckrose, who did the project with us, the Grievance Studies project. She and I went on to explain the different schools of thought in a book called Cynical Theories that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. We published that. We finished writing it awkwardly in middle of 2017, August 31, 19, not 17. August 31, 2019 was the due date to the publisher. So it was due to come out in like March or April or something like that, because it takes them a long time to finalize and to market, blah, blah, blah. And then COVID hit and there was no paper, so they couldn't print books. So we got delayed until August of 2020. So now George Floyd has died. The country's literally on fire in its large cities. It's all based off of somehow, we're in this pandemic. Nobody's allowed to go outside. You're not allowed to see your family die. But if you're protesting racial injustice, there's no virus. You can do whatever you want. And so, all of a sudden there's this huge open question about, what in the world's going on. Critical race theory is a word that's now on the map. And we've written the only book in the world that has a explanatory and critical perspective on critical race theory. So it turns out, we sold out through like 14 print runs the summer of 2020 with that book. We couldn't print enough to meet the demand. It just kept selling out 10,000, 20, 15,000 at a time. And that really kind of put us on the map for talking about these issues. And I chased critical race theory specifically through the end of 19, well before George Floyd died, until middle of 21, at which point I did a workshop that became the book Race Marxism. And when I finished writing and finalizing that book, it came out in February 22, I said that I've now said the last thing I ever want to say about critical race theory. There's nothing else for me to say about it. So I would still get dragged to talk about it, but I didn't want to. And I started firing my guns at critical education, or critical pedagogy as it's called, and at queer theory, which was the right time to do that because it all kind of blew up with the parents movement caring about what was going on in schools. And so I just tracked and traced this stuff.
It sometimes feels to me that you have almost two public personas when it comes to these topics. You have you smile because you know what I'm talking about. You have the very thoughtful academic, and then you have the Twitter troll who will go out aggressively into the fastest, hot takiest. It's not even a hot take. It's basically the battlefield of insanity that goes on media.
Yeah, I do some hot taking, but it's mostly even just like clap back, as they call it. Yeah, somebody throws some trash and I clap back. Yeah, so there's actually a method behind that madness. A lot of people don't know this. I was one of these people back in the day. I got on Twitter originally in 2012. So I'm not unaware. I've been on the platform a lot for like 13 years, right? So I'm very familiar, over 13 years. I'm very familiar with kind of the dynamic. For a long time, I got a lot of praise and accolades for being one of the most patient people, for giving these detailed conversations, engaging long arguments or discussions, not always arguments, a lot of times just discussions. And it's impossible to have that kind of discourse as your account crosses a certain threshold in size. It just becomes impossible. You have hundreds of replies, each one of which could turn into this, not just like a thread of discussion with one person, but like, it's like Conceptual James, that's my handle, and the guy I'm arguing with, and 15 others are now in this tree of argumentation, right? And it's impossible to do it. And then what I noticed was that a lot of these by 14, 15, 16, what I had noticed was that a lot of these activists did not appear to be arguing in good faith. They would call names, they'd make accusations. And what I thought was I didn't have a very big account until after the Grievance Studies affair, at which point I blew up very, very quickly, probably because I went on Joe Rogan. I went from having 8,000 followers. I weirdly remember 8,000 followers when we dropped the Grievance Studies affair in October of 18 to 11,000 after it came out, to then I went on Joe Rogan's podcast around the end of the year and it went to 80,000 like overnight. So I grew, my account grew by 7 times basically overnight. And then I went on Joe Rogan again when Cynical Theories came out, and I was in the low 100s, and it went up to almost 300,000. In fact, when I went on Joe Rogan's podcast the second time in the summer of 2020, my account grew so fast, I got locked out of it and got an email from Twitter saying that there was suspicious activity because they thought I was buying followers. Because it went up so ridiculously fast. They obviously don't have such limits on there now, I don't think, but I got a letter from them or an email from them telling me it looked fake. So, and they locked me out for 12 hours. So at any rate, once you get to a certain size, you can't have these kinds of arguments. And that size is pretty small. 8 or 10,000 is already too many. But then secondly, I noticed there are no prominent voices who will answer in bad faith to the bad faith that they were given. And what I realized is that there's this expectation that's being taken advantage of, that they're going to say something, whether it's in good faith or bad faith, and you're going to answer in good faith, which they can take advantage of to keep you on the hook and just kind of keep driving you nuts. Because this is what the game of trolling is. They give you a bad faith statement to get you to interact in good faith, and then they laugh at you for having fallen for it. That's what trolling actually is. And so I just decided I was going to do an experiment and become the only kind of prominent voice account that would trash talk back and see what happened. And I thought it was fun. And in fact, it became this kind of like psychological shield rather than getting sucked into these horrible, sprawling 3-day arguments where you don't even want to go to bed because you're so like worked up over it. All of a sudden, it was just like I could just make a your mom joke or something and move on with my day. And it became like this tool that gave me a psychological break from the toxic dynamic of bad faith trolling itself. So it was less trolling and more counter trolling.
Right. But
it worked.
But this is interesting because you're pointing out to two aspects, even in your in your choice of tactic.
Yeah.
One being, this is a social statement about what discourse I value and which I don't.
Yes.
The other is a personal epistemic defense mechanism.
Right. And so the first one was intentional, and the second one was a discovery that I had not intended, that I then maintained and actually increased, and kind of tried to figure out the right boundaries with it. And now I still do some of it, but I don't do as much of it. I've grown into as it's called, post and ghost method more than I had in the past.
So this is what I was going to ask you. And I'm asking this as we are, us as a species are now navigating what it means to have a public discourse when one of the main stages, some would argue the main stage, is social media. And this is the nature of social media. It's not, Elon Musk has changed the dials a little bit in terms of the volume of inanity and insanity, but this is the essence of the product, with or without him, before and after him. So the question is, what does somebody like you, who has so much to offer in terms of their analytical view, in terms of their ability to encompass both rigorous intellectual, ballast and criticism of trends that they see around them? And I will point this to my listeners. We didn't go down that road because we have done this before in other podcasts. But James, if you ask James to explain the intellectual underpinnings of critical race theory or any of these critical theories, critical legal theories, etc., his explanation is one of the most lucid and fair that you will hear. And, I made a point because, as listeners know, I've encountered those theories out of fascination back when I was in Israel 15 years ago. And I was looking at them with a mix of horror and intense curiosity because they were so weird and so out there and so clearly potentially powerful in leading down dangerous roads. But I took them seriously. And so does James. So somebody with that skill set, with that intellectual ballast, your voice is valuable in being recognized as thoughtful, as earnest, as not Milo Yiannopoulos, right? As an anti-Tucker Carlson. is there a danger if the way you need to navigate yourself in one of those critical social stages is trollish or counter trollish? Is there a danger that antagonizes people who could actually listen, or even diminish your ability to ultimately change the moderate, sane, I don't know if it's a majority or minority anymore, but the moderate remnant of the American liberal discourse?
Yeah, it's possible. I hear it a lot. So it's actually plausible. I aspire to be better. And then all of a sudden I am served up something. It's like, don't spike the volleyball. And then the volleyball is just right there. And you're like, I hit the volleyball before I realized I shouldn't have done that. And but I never do it in my podcasts. I never do it in my long form writing. I never do it in in-person appearances. I never do it in face-to-face conversations. And so, it's this mixed bag. Maybe it hurts what I'm doing, and I think it probably does. And I should probably continue to strive to be toward the better angels of my nature there. But at the same time, there is something about the fact that social media is intrinsically riddled with bad faith that can't be ignored. And we're not going to go into, can I give a lucid explanation of what these theories are? But just to kind of back up your point, first of all, I have always endeavored not to strawman anything. I was building out a social justice encyclopedia, is what I called it, in order to explain the terminology. And every single entry, which is around 200 of them that I finally ended up writing, starts with me quoting at length directly people who believe in this ideology before I explain what I think they mean. And so I'm always very transparent like that. But it's the testament to the fact that I can give these lucid explanations, I think, is the number of times, and it's many, that I've gone and given a speech somewhere. This happened at Yale a couple of weeks ago, where people will show up and they expect that I am just kind of an internet troll. And then they find out that there's substance there, to the point where they tell the organizer or tell me directly, I expected he was just going to say bigoted things, but he actually understands the subject very deeply. He really surprised me. I had a communist come up to me after one of the lectures I gave on communism, I think at a university, but I don't remember exactly where we were. And he said, I am a communist, and I thought you were going to straw man our views, but you gave the most, I don't agree with you in your interpretation, but you gave the most accurate and lucid and well-read explanation of our views that I've ever heard somebody who doesn't agree with it give. And so I try never to straw man the views that I have, which means that, in interviews, I end up giving these, I get made fun of for this. This is the nature. We go back to the X or Twitter phenomenon. So I just saw a video of myself the other day where I got asked a question, and I didn't want to straw man the thing that I was responding to. And I wanted to demonstrate that I understand the argument that they're making. And so I, much like I've done many times already in this episode, I gave like a 14-minute reply to some question. And so this video gets made mocking me for giving this 14-minute reply, where they just keep speeding it up to faster and faster and faster and saying, James still isn't done. Look, he's still not done. Now we're at 1,000x speed. He's still not done. And it's like, do you want me to respect your views and give them the right treatment? Or do you want me to say your mother's a whore and move on? Like, which one do you want? I can do one or the other. I don't have a middle. And this is kind of that, it speaks straight to that problem, because I'll go and I'll give an hour-long lecture on communism and have communists come up and say, I disagree with you, but I respect how well you articulated our views. And then somebody will take that and say, look how long and complicated and stupid his argument was. And so nobody should listen to him. And so I'm kind of caught between these things all the time. I actually say that the hardest thing in my professional life is that I can be long enough to be accurate and nobody will read it or engage with it, or I can be short enough to be punchy, in which case I'm actually wrong. And I don't know which of those two roads I should take, but there's no third road. There's no halfway. There's no anything in between. You're either thorough and steelman the argument that you're going to take apart correctly, which starts with articulating it correctly, or you say something, glib or whatever, something that's a great 20-second talking point on Fox News or whatever, and you're rightfully criticized for having missed all the nuance. The only solution that I've come up with for this so far is a bad solution, because it doesn't have the context present in a single object, is to present the long form argument somewhere, have it ready, then do the glib thing. And then when people say you don't know what you're talking about, give them the long form thing and say, yes, I do.
A bifurcated James Lindsay.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's exactly right. It's a bifurcated situation. And I don't know what to do about it. But like I said, also, sometimes you get this thing, they make this video. It's like, I just intentionally was thoughtful. I didn't have to respect some of these views, but I went on and on about it to make sure I had articulated it correctly. Then they mock me for it. And I'm like, spike the football. Bang, right in their face. That's the idea. But I don't know. I don't know what you do with this. I mean, I could like Steven Pinker it and turn off my comments and get mocked for that. I could just ignore everything and get accused James never debates or engages. It's like social media is designed so that there's at least somebody who makes sure that you lost no matter what you did.
Right. And I think that's the nature of it. Implied in my original admonition was my own struggle with this question. My solution is, first of all, to not participate in social media. That's not a world that I have grown attached to. So I'm one of the lurkers. But it does trouble me because I don't know what the solution is either. I don't think that necessarily being the ideal, like the platonic ideal of the public intellectual that I have in my mind on social media and shunning all kind of id-based behavior is the right way to survive in this media world, in this information environment. I don't know. What about the possibility of, rather than thinking about how to engage with the cloud of, or this distortion field that is social media, maybe the question should be how to more aggressively exclude people from it. And I don't mean by that have Elon more aggressively moderate, but figuring out how to draw lines where you recognize when a conversation is unserious and maybe even point it out as, you are excluded from this debate. You do not deserve my time. Rather than attacking the person, you want to to live a trollish life. You want to have bad faith, which is the majority of participants on these platforms. That is your right. Maybe you're making money out of it. Maybe it turns you on. But you are not entitled to my time or attention. And I would argue that you are not entitled to the time and attention of my actual followers.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who have different strategies for that. And some of people have been pretty successful with it. My friend Chris Elston, who goes by Billboard Chris, has been mostly successful with this by aggressively curating his reply environment to where it has largely become known. He still gets an enormous amount of garbage, but if he goes through his replies, and if he sees garbage, he not only hides the reply, but he'll usually block the person who made it on that logic that we're trying to have serious conversations here. You're derailing the conversation. You're not participating any longer. And that's, I have taken that road some, but it becomes almost impossible to keep up with, especially now that they can produce bots for literally nothing. The other problem, actually, I think, is that I don't think that, we need Elon doing what old Twitter did, which was to actually censor people. I got censored. I got kicked off for almost 6 months for aggravating a trans activist. But I don't think that we should be in that regime, but his stated goal was something that he called freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. And what has happened in practice is that there are ways to game the algorithm by which, rather than objectionable or bad faith or trollish behavior being low in the algorithm, which is what they had as an intention, allegedly, it actually ends up being very high in the algorithm. And it's because the algorithm is actually very easy to game. Nick Fuentes, for example, is very good at gaming the algorithm. You can see on his posts, if you see one that's fresh, and I bring it up because it's very important to see it when it's new, to see this phenomenon. Many people have reported on it. I've seen hard data that are coming out soon proving that it's the case. So I know it's true. I'm not saying anything salacious. I'm not making anything up. But Nick Fuentes gets retweet numbers and other engagement numbers, likes, retweets, and view counts on his posts in an impossible to be organic fashion in the first, and I said it has to be fresh because it's in the first 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 minutes. It vastly outstrips, for example, Elon Musk, who has 100 times his following or more, who obviously is the owner of the platform, is arguably one of the most famous people in the world. He's got the largest account on the platform. He has humongous engagement numbers, and somehow Nick Fuentes is blowing him out of the water, not just proportionally to his account size, but even just objectively. Even today, Nick Fuentes was bragging that he ratioed Elon Musk.
And within that critical first 20-minute time frame.
Correct, which the algorithm detects as it being something extremely hot that's going viral, and it skyrockets it to the top of the algorithm. But there's no reason to believe that this is organic behavior. So again, when we're now in this situation, which was primitive, if it even existed 5 years ago, of being able to manipulate the algorithm with massive farms of bots and trolls. I mean, the Discord or back channel server issue has always been real. But it's not as fast as something automated, that there are automated ways to inflate yourself within the algorithm. And that, as I've heard, but again, this is hearsay, but it's, secondhand, the X team cannot keep up. Every time they tweak the algorithm to figure out how to get ahead of this problem, the algorithm gamers figure out how to get ahead of them, usually within as little as 24 to 48 hours at the most. And so this is a different problem, which is inauthentic engagement, the algorithm favoring inauthentic engagement and not knowing how to get around it, which causes the conversation itself, not just your conversation with one guy. You posted something that was, edgy or whatever, and it creates whatever frisson. Not just that, but rather the global conversation is highly tailored by manipulative tools. And Nick Fuentes is just the most visible and obvious character that these tools are applying to. We can be certain,
and arguably the most pernicious.
Yes. And we can be certain that it's happening much more widely. It's happening around certain keywords. I know that if I post on X and post certain keywords, that it's guaranteed that I'm going to get, 24 replies within 10 minutes that are just straight abuse, mostly from, word, bunch of numbers accounts. And, like fish burger 56791.
Anime/Roman statue profile.
Totally, every time. And there have got to be keyword triggers that trigger automated responses as well. There's all kinds of stuff going on that we don't clearly understand. And I think this raises serious questions about the viability of social media, at least in the AI age, for being a square for meaningful public discourse or meaningful political discourse.
But it is going to be used that way.
That I don't know. I actually don't. I suspect you're right. I don't know, because it's so inauthentic and so toxic that more and more and more normal people are actually checking out, not checking in. They're getting burned out on it. They're tired of it after, sometimes days, often months is enough to fry somebody on this, and they check out. So at some point you end up with dead internet theory. The problem is that politicians, I'll just say it, it's not just Tim Walz. They're all retarded. And so what they're doing is they're following the numbers that they see on social media as though this is indicative, as if there was like a poll, or if it's, some serious thing. And they're following these trends. And more importantly, their staffers are embedded in social media and following these trends.
Vox populi, vox dei.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And but it's vox botuli, not vox populi. It's bots and foreign actors using bots, and malicious actors within the domestic scene using bots or servers or whatever else to manipulate the conversation. So what I worry about I do worry about people just checking out. I would rather see it become a vibrant and thriving discussion platform, but these problems have to be solved or they will check out, I think. The problem remains, though, that it's not, there was an article, it was a brilliant article. I mean, it might have been a stupid article, but the headline at least is brilliant from, it's got to be almost a decade ago. But it was, the problem is not that Twitter is real. It's that people think Twitter is real. At least that was the gist of it. I don't know if that's exactly how the headline went, but it was something that is like the Atlantic or the New Yorker, one of these, snobby kind of outlets. And they came out with this, but the problem is not that Twitter is real. It's that people think it's real. And what will happen is it'll be a diminishing set of people who are desperate for social affirmation of their views or to take cues for which directions to go. So it'll be like newscasters and influencers and interns and politicians who are the only people paying attention to whatever, Jihadi Bot 2000 wants to have to say on social media all the time. And that will be the slowest thing to correct itself.
Right. Because this goes to the bigger problem that I'm constantly struggling with these days, which is the shifting place of, I don't know, I would call it like epistemic legitimacy. And you can associate that as part of the overtone window shifts. But ultimately, it's the question of epistemic legitimacy. This is why I think thinking about exclusion and how do we create tools for exclusion, whether it's, and again, I don't mean tools for exclusion systematic or like encoded or legal tools for exclusion. I'm talking about heuristic and conversational tools for redrawing lines of legitimacy about the conversation and what is and isn't legitimate. Because right now, the worst players are enjoying the charisma of success or false projected success, whether it's success by the local elections, like the populism, the worst aspects of populism by Zoran Mamdani in New York, or the worst ideas of Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes through the bodified regime of Twitter. They're all enjoying that charismatic influence, and charisma creates legitimacy. Mm-hmm. Charisma changes overtone windows. And the problem for the classically liberal tribe, what my friend and former boss Jonah Goldberg calls the tribe of liberty, what the problem that we need to deal with is how do we reclaim or redraw the circle of legitimacy? Mm-hmm. And that's an epistemic and sociological challenge. And it starts with thinking about exclusion. But what do you think?
I mean, it has to. I mean, gatekeeping out of crazy things is literally kind of the definition of establishing legitimacy. And that's in any domain. It's not how do you know what to pay attention to? It's how do you know what not to include, or more importantly, to pay attention to. In the social media environment, we have kind of a novel circumstance, which is that we actually have more noise than we have signal all the time, everywhere, in every regard. And there's always a lot of noise out there. There's some guy out there who's going to be like, you've never worked a radar or something, because there's tons of noise and it's hard to find the signal. But there's so much noise constantly within the social media sphere. And it's now so hard to tell what's a genuine signal and a false signal that it becomes extremely difficult to navigate what you're saying is epistemic legitimacy, or how do we answer the question of not what is or not even true, but what is or not valid as a good faith part of the conversation. And that's become extremely difficult. And I do think it has to come with inclusion, or the question of exclusion. I think it's not coincidental that so much of the social justice movement pushed this idea of inclusion of alternative ways of thinking, alternative ways of knowing. And then what we're seeing is kind of this explosion and proliferation of that mentality. Well, if their way of knowing is in, mine should be in too. Fair is fair, right? So if we're going to have black ways of knowing, we have to have white ways of knowing. And now we just have identity politics as a legitimizing factor in all regards, which doesn't get us anywhere except to tribalism. So we have this real question. I experiment with it. I mean, I tweeted yesterday. I'm still very proud of this tweet. Actually, I said, you've got a stopped clock can be right twice a day, but you don't point at the stop clock. Let's say you look at the clock at the right time and you're like, look, it's the clock told us what time it is, and you happen to be right because it's at 1 out of 2 coincidental times of the day. The second you realize the clock is broken, whether it's before that moment or not, you never point people to look at the broken clock, right? You understand that you exclude that clock from your reckoning of time because it's not, yes, it's correct twice a day, but it's not a reliable method of telling what the time is. And I, as someone who almost missed a flight because of a stopped clock one time, very nearly missed a flight because of a stopped clock. I kind of appreciate that, right? I didn't know the clock was stopped when I looked at it. It was close enough for reckoning. And then the next thing you know, it's 2 hours later. I'm not paying that much attention to the clock. I happen to look at it and I think I still have some time. Then all of a sudden I thought I can't have that much time. And I realized my flight left in 15 minutes and I had to run to the gate from where I was in the lounge with a broken clock. So, I mean, we understand that you're going to exclude the broken clock. The thing is, though, is we're exposed to new things that we're not used to in our kind of epistemic terrain, which is...
before, remember what you're about to say, but just one more point about the clock. It is even more tricky because the broken clocks sometimes know what they're doing. They're not accidentally right sometimes.
Yeah, there's some guy comes and sets it to the time that it's going to be in 10 minutes so that you see it and you're like, aha.
Because they know, in the conversation, people who are trolls or clout farmers or whatever they are, they know how to get the attention of the good faith seekers. They know how to seduce us and play to it. And once they grab a chunk of that audience who was originally there because they were outraged about the insanity of somebody else, and they're like, oh, look, I'm the reasonable alternative. Yeah. And once you're captured, it's a little more difficult to then realize, wait, this person is not actually playing in good faith. They were just playing the good faith actor in this very minor sliver of a discourse in order to grab me.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue, actually, from clock to the thing I wanted to say, which is that we basically live in that Spider-Man meme where the Spider-Mans are pointing at each other, which is people saying you're a bad faith actor. No, you're a bad faith actor. In other words, what we live in is a new regime of rampant exposure to political warfare in a way that is very hard to do when, your biggest thing that you can pull off is a town hall. Right now, everybody's a broadcaster, but also because everybody's a broadcaster, everybody's like a replying or counter broadcaster. So you put out a thing and somebody else can say a thing and a million people see it. And so you have this different paradigm. And this has become the playground for political warfare actors in particular, it's not a troll. This is a particular kind of bad actor who wants, with hostile intent, to create a certain social, cultural, or political outcome as a result of the things that they are saying or doing. So it is actually a form of warfare. And it's not clear how to navigate this on the mass scale. Basically, all of a sudden, when we're probably at the point where if we did a poll and 5% of the population had heard of the term political warfare right now, I would be surprised. So we're being subjected on social media. Everybody who's active on social media is being subjected to political warfare. They don't know what political warfare is. They probably have never heard of it. So they take things at face value that they obviously shouldn't. And it becomes very difficult to determine what you include, what you don't. The very easy fence that could be put up in principle, but maybe not in practice, is that let's say that there's a known group, because these things exist, of a known troll farm or whatever of, say, Russian operatives who do Russian pro-Russia propaganda or anti-whatever propaganda in the United States. It is an American national security issue to actually screen that known group from their easy access to social media. How you do that in practice is very hard. What you would do in principle is very easy. Those people are excluded, right? And so we're in this situation where there are very obvious players who should be excluded, bots and trolls being kind of the main ones, especially malicious foreign actors who are seeding with propaganda. But we also, we have built the tools that allow them immediate access to people's brains in their living rooms with their guard down, but not the tools to be able to screen those people out and keep them from being able to influence our public conversation. There is a tool that could actually solve this problem, but it's kind of a prohibited tool, and it maybe could solve this problem. I think it could solve the problem, but it's a prohibited tool because it's also a trap. And that's, of course, full-blown digital ID so that nobody online is anonymous and all of this stuff. And so you know exactly who somebody is. You can know exactly where their account is based, regardless of VPN activity, et cetera, et cetera. So you basically wipe anonymity out because everybody has now a digital ID tied to their individual person, and it becomes much easier to either screen out entire foreign actor operations, or to identify bad actors with a name that therefore attaches to the reputation in a different way. Like if we found out, for example, that Nick Fuentes was himself hiring trolls and bots and things to amplify his message, that would hurt his credibility. Well, if you could have that in a situation with digital ID, where we all just kind of can find out who everybody is, the reputation that we take for granted in real life kind of comes back into play on social media. But at the same time, we don't want digital ID because we can all perceive very, very quickly and easily how that can be used against us, and how there are even kind of openly described plans to weaponize it against us, like building out social credit systems and so on. So we're in this weird phase where the answer to the question is absolutely crucial. How do we determine what information is legitimate, whether right or wrong? I'm going to use the word that the woke people like to use, which is valid, for admitting it to the table. And then there's true and false as like a stronger, determiner. So you could have valid information that turns out to be false.
And arguably, the determination of falsity should happen within the valid discussion.
Correct. Yeah, the idea would be that if something's invalid, you don't even bring it into the discussion. Exactly. And if something is, but it might be false, but it deserves a debate. That is an easier way to phrase it, is what deserves debate, right? Just because somebody said something, does that mean it deserves debate? The answer is no. Well, what if some guy said something and he has 1 million followers? Does that mean we have to debate it? Well, maybe no. But what if the guy has 1 million followers and it goes viral? Do we have to debate it now? The answer seems to be yes, even though it might be equally crazy and equally unfounded and just completely made up whole cloth. And the evidence is coming. It's just on my next episode behind my paywall.
Right. But this is the thing, that this shows you that those are different games that are being played. One game is we are trying to determine what is valid in order to ascertain veracity, whereas somebody else is playing the game of how do I monetize other people's outrage? And the liberal game of seeking truth is of no concern to them. That's part of what bad faith means. Yeah. And then that's a problem. If that person already has a large following and clearly impacts the discourse, should the liberal game the people who take the liberal game seriously address those conversations or still exclude them despite their reach?
It's funny because it's not all that often that conversations get to come pretty much full circle. But now we're back to the question of the grievance studies affair and what it showed, which was, in fact, that the old gatekeeping methods failed. And we all know the problem, which is, it's not a problem in one sense, because we would want to know this. We know that the old gatekeeping methods failed. Editorial control, peer review, et cetera, have been shown to be, at the very best, highly corruptible, at the very worst, intrinsically flawed at their very premises. And this puts us in this, new... It's almost like the wild, wild west of knowledge. I have a friend, his name's Mike Nana. He describes it as knowledge Catholics versus knowledge Protestants. And basically, the internet nailed the 95 Theses to the wall. And now there's all these people who have discovered the scripture for the first time, and they're reading it in their vernacular languages for the first time, and they're running off and creating denominations. And the Catholics, which would refer to, the old knowledge gatekeeping institutions or epistemic gatekeeping institutions, have now lost their grip. They can no longer control. But the consequence of that explosion in the short term was like the 30 Years' War, which is a serious problem. And then eventually we reached the Peace of Westphalia. We realized that's not a great way to go. But even that, Europe was still pitted by religious wars up until more or less America was founded on the idea of let's not have those. And it set a different standard for the world in terms of, productivity and national unity, which is now falling apart.
And intellectually, socially, classical liberalism is the product of that period, is the response to that period.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, I did a podcast on this a couple of years ago called Welcome to the Second Enlightenment. But the point is also that the disruptions that we see after the printing press and after the Reformation are all going to come kind of on like 21st century steroids now. But on the other side, we solve these epistemic adequacy questions and we enter into a new realm of knowledge production that is pretty much beyond the horizon of what we can actually imagine right now. But on the other hand, those disruptions are not pretty. And like I said, Mike Nana calls this, I don't like the term, but I think it's the right idea, knowledge Catholics or epistemic Catholics versus epistemic Protestants. And the Protestants are proliferating. So in a sense, what this thrusts us into, if we accept that idea, is it thrusts us into an actual state of postmodernity where knowledges actually get recognized as local phenomena because we don't know how to access the epistemic tools to root them back down to an objective shared reality that's universal to every group. We do know some tools, experimentation is still universal, observation of the real world is still universal, but we have this now phenomenological or interpretive layer that's being thrust in between us and the world as we understand it.
And casts doubt on what replaced the actual Catholics, the real Roman Catholics, which was the scientific revolution and the modernity. And modernity became the unifying Catholic ideology and the method by which the universe was interpreted. And now the decentralization of information and the localization of knowledge, or the turning of knowledge as a local phenomena, as you put it, destabilizes even the parts that are supposed to be unifying in our knowledge gathering episteme.
I think it actually liquefies basically everything. So, one of the proposed solutions is, okay, so we need to return to a magisterium or basically a new resurgence, not literally, well, maybe literally, but not specifically literally the Catholic faith, but of some religious architecture that says this is how we determine what is and is not true. And we kind of go back toward this theocratic model or a monarchical episcopate that just has the power to force people to live within a single epistemic regime. And that solution is not going to work. The cat is out of the bag. The tools cannot be controlled by you either. China is the world's best experiment in trying to control those tools, and it's failing. I mean, I've been to China a bunch of times. Almost everybody I know there knows how to get on a VPN and get around the Great Firewall if they want to. And a lot of them do. Some of them don't. The social credit aspect adds this new layer. But now the problems of the social credit system are becoming manifest, where you have these kind of like social credit homeless ghost people who can't get above water on their social credit because now they're homeless, which is a negative social credit circumstance. And they're just kind of this like growing doomsday contingent that will eventually cause a rupture in the social environment of the country. And so it doesn't work. The cat is actually out of the bag. The tools are actually there. And just like this kind of postmodernist localization of knowledge, and as we might actually call it, the Spider-Man meme epistemic state, like you're a Fed, no, you're a Fed. I thought you were a Fed. Oh, but you're a Fed. Nobody knows who's a real actor and who's a false actor. Nobody knows what's good and bad faith. That can liquefy, to use kind of Zygmunt Bauman's terminology for this, that can liquefy, I think, any regime. And this is the problem, is like we're in this kind of mass liquefaction stage that we haven't figured out how to reestablish and find terra firma within or beneath or on top of one of those three arrangements. We don't even know which one it is. And so I don't think that the proposed solutions that the radical right is offering are realistic. Nor do I think that the solutions offered by the radical left, which is to continue to liquefy, are workable. And the classical liberals are out here, kind of running 19th century technology up against this 21st century problem and are sort of stuck.
Social technology.
That's right. And so for me, the question has been, because I think that preserving individual liberty is going to be paramount. And I think, like I said, the CCP kind of provides us with some proof of that. But I think that doing so is going to require us to think very much differently than we have before about what is the individual and why is that character so important. And if we're going to have the individual, the only way, ultimately this is what the classical liberal revolutions of the 18th century recognized, was that if you're going to have an individual, the only way the individual can stay free to act as an individual rather than being forced to subsume into a collective is by securing certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property being the three, and the property being also the pursuit of happiness. In other words, your use of your property to do as you want with it. Those things, I think privacy kind of works into that too. Those things are highly in question now. So we don't have a theory of the individual in the social media era that I think is fully robust, but we also don't have a theory. I mean, property is the most obvious, but even questions like life and liberty come up, or if you're locked out of your social media, or is that the same as being kind of in social prison? That's a liberty type question. With some of the kind of access to medical technology, transhumanist stuff that's on the horizon, you have real questions about life. What is life if you're able to be digitally uploaded? That kind of stuff. That's beside the point at the moment because it's still a little bit ahead of where we are, but it's coming. But technologically, property is a mess. What the hell is digital property? And the example I always give is if I pull out my cell phone, all right, and I type something on my cell phone and I put it on my website and I publish it, copyright James Lindsay, no question asked. That's my intellectual property. If you steal it, I can pursue that legally, make you take it down, give you damages, whatever. We understand this concept of intellectual property. It's a little bit murky, but like when Napster came along, it really threw a big question mark on that, right? If I own an MP3 file and I want to give you a copy of the MP3 file and not charge you, can I do that? Can you have file sharing? Can it be a public file sharing platform? Blah, 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 right? So intellectual property started to get murky once we started to have the ability to do so very cheaply, very wide scale. Like I could upload, a Metallica song and 3 million people could download it. So I become a distributor to 3 million people rather than, I made a cassette and I handed you the cassette that I had to go buy a blank cassette. And it's a very clunky thing in the 1980s and 1990s to make a copy.
This problem of lack of scarcity when it comes to the digital world, it's even implicit in the words that we use. When you upload a song online or put it on your social media, are you sharing it or are you publishing it?
Yeah, right.
Therein lies an entire legal universe of difference.
That's right. And then beyond that, so I take out my cell phone and I pull out and I type on it and I type up an essay and I publish it. And so I'm the user. This is the device. I did the thing with the device. I published the thing, right? There's no question who owns the intellectual rights to the essay. It's mine. But while I did that, I generated a bunch of metadata that the device manufacturer owns. Why? Why is the data that I produced mine in some sense, but the metadata that I produced belonged to Samsung?
The bit of information of James Lindsay right now is in location X at hour X. Mm-hmm. Got online.
I don't own any of that.
Right. And it is commodified. Not only do they own it, it is being commodified. It is.
Yeah, that's right. They sell it in order to do marketing. Everybody knows that. They've typed something on their phone or said it out loud. And the next thing they know, they open Instagram, scroll down 3 things, and there's an ad for the thing they were talking about. And we've all experienced this now. And how did that happen? Is it that how did it get on your Instagram? Well, somebody that's got an advertising relationship with Instagram has an algorithm that knows that you talked about it, that fed that information. That information had to be gathered and without your consent sold, or by implicit consent or some 200-page, user agreement that you never read. You have to agree to use the product. Therefore, you don't care. You just press go because you want to use Instagram or you want to use the microphone on your phone or whatever it happens to be. And you agree to it, but you never really agree to it. Not by intent. You do so because it's like a gatekeeping object. And so you have this really weird circumstance where it's not clear at all what property is. Now, I talk about it with metadata on a phone, which is being sold not just, by the way, to advertisers, but to intelligence communities. And yes, that is happening. I've had very uncomfortable conversations about that I didn't mean to have. It is being sold to intelligence communities as well. It's being gathered and used for all kinds of things. But my favorite example of this, actually, I read this article. I've searched and searched to find it again. It blew my mind. It's one of the, every time I bring it up, you'll publish this. I'm going to get an email. Can you find the article? Listen right now, guys. No, I can't. I don't know where it is. I've never found it again. But there was an article written, I read some years ago. There's no way I would have made this up because it's way too detailed, where it talked about these high-tech John Deere tractors. And it's not about right to fix, which is also that the tractor runs proprietary software. So if something breaks down on it, some guy has to come out from John Deere and fix your tractor, which is bad at harvest when you have days before your crop rots. You have this right to fix argument that's a huge debate with physical property now because of the software it runs. But technically, what I learned in reading this article is that when you buy your fancy $500,000 or $1 million John Deere tractor, you don't own the tractor because the tractor runs a bunch of proprietary software that you can't own because it's copyrighted. So you are technically, no matter what, leasing the vehicle. That gets into the right to fix thing. But more than that, these tractors today are pretty cool. They have lots of sensors on them. Like by the way the wheels are rolling over the soil, they can make pretty accurate guesses of soil density. They can somehow take estimates of the water in the soil and all this stuff. So what it said was that the technology at the time, this would have been a few years ago, so I'm sure it's better now, was that you can drive your tractor around and do whatever it is you do in your field as a farmer, driving your tractor around, and it can create a 1 centimeter square resolution map of all of these different variables like, water, soil density, maybe fertilizer or something, compounds, whatever, of your farm, all this data. Okay, so, this is your farm. It's your tractor, or so you think. You drove it. You are the user. You are technically, in your mind at least, the owner and operator of the equipment. And you generate this map of your farm. And the obvious selling point is you go log into your John Deere account and there's your map. And you're like, oh, that part of my farm is dry. It needs more irrigation. That part is saturated. I need less irrigation. And you can farm better. And the tractor gives you all the tools to farm better. And you're like, yes, I want that. But what they don't tell you is in the user agreement for the tractor that they're also taking that data about your farm and selling it to futures traders who are running sophisticated AI programs to predict how well you're managing your farm so they can bet against your farm on the market or on your commodity on the market, which has everything to do with your success or failure as a farmer. And John Deere makes money selling it to them, and they make money betting against you, and you have zero options whatsoever to either turn those features off on your tractor or to say, I prohibit you from selling the data because you don't own the data, because it's considered some kind of like metadata or part of the copyrighted thing that you can't own in your tractor. I forget the legal details. But this opens a real question of, if I were to write something or take a picture with my phone, everybody understands that I have the copyright to the thing. But there are other things I can do with any device, whether a phone or a tractor, where all of a sudden I don't own the data that I'm generating. And in fact, that data can be sold to somebody else's profit and used against me in that sale. In a sense, even not necessarily selling it to your direct competitor, but I guess that's in principle possible, but selling it to traders who manipulate the market against you. And so this is
which is again, because we're working within an 18th century legal framework of what constitutes intellectual property.
Correct. And so the question becomes, how in the world do we secure the individual in the 21st century if we don't know what their property rights even look like? We don't even know what the property looks like. And we haven't even got into like your likeness, right? Do I own my likeness of my face? I know AI can generate my voice so well that my wife can't tell the difference. I've done the experiment.
Yeah. And I mean, I've certainly had my fun playing with that. And
that's one of those things like the papers. It's fun until all of a sudden you have a moment that it's not fun anymore.
No, it's horrific. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Morbid fun. I should have qualified. But this is, first, as a side thought, this is very revealing on the prevailing sentiment of American media that the stories that you're describing are generally covered under the concern for privacy rights, not property rights.
Yeah.
A bit of a detail that's interesting, that for the average American journalist, privacy is a point of concern. Property, not so much. But the deep question of what does it mean to protect the individual for the classical liberal of the 21st century is such a deep problem. And I think the right, as you pointed out, the new integralist recatholization right, literally recatholization right, but also the left, I think both of them are doing partly the same thing, which is both the localization of tradition and the attempt to impose an authoritative view. And I think part of the impulse that's driving them, both the right and the left, is understandable because we are experiencing this sense of cultural and ethical deracination and dissimulation. There is no grounding. We are at sea. We are seeking some firm footing. You call it terra firma earlier. Mm-hmm. And they too, I would say, both left and right, the liquidators on the left and the expansionist theologians of the right, they are both following an earlier playbook. But if we are in our 18th and 19th century playbook, they're reverting to pre-modern tribalist systems. There's nothing new about turning downwards towards the smallest tribal unit and believing that your tribal truth obviates everything else. Mm-hmm. Your only duty is to preserve tribal integrity. The problem is not just for us as liberals, but for our entire species. We have not figured out how to have a conversation within the scope of what we're actually dealing with. So we are committed to the virtues that we see in the system that brought us individual rights and protections, and we think that have established the prosperity and freedoms that we value in the world today, while they, thinking that our system has led us to this current brinkmanship, are reverting farther back to primordial systems, ancient ideas about human order. But all of us are bound to fail if we don't really take into account the change.
Yeah, I think that is right. And I like I said, I think the North Star here has to be, how do we preserve individual liberty? Because I think that that's the actual centerpiece of prosperity, abundance, etc. Everything that makes a society worth living in, kind of in a profound way, begins from preserving individual liberty, unless you happen to be one of the luckies among the more privileged class in that society. And so, like the aristocracy. And so for the vast majority of people, if you are interested in having prosperity and abundance and unlocking greater prosperity and abundance for everybody, which does raise like the poorest people today, not maybe the very poorest, but most of the poor people of the United States still enjoy a standard of living in excess of what the majority of people in pre-modern times would have experienced. And you can look in the third world and see that that's true. So the question becomes, how do we keep our vision on individual liberty and make clear what it looks like to secure individual liberty against the various forces that threaten it in this new situation? Well, it's a new and old situation. Some of it's old, right? Tribal identity is old, but then the digital property rights is totally new, totally unfathomable in the 18th century when these ideas were kind of jotted down. This is, I think, the challenge. But the North Star has to be, well, what do we want to do? We want to maintain free societies that produce high levels of abundance, that can solve the problems that arise even in these new, kind of socio-technological contexts. And the problem is that it's not clear what those answers even look like. And the underlying philosophical groundwork, I don't think, has even been done to lay the foundation upon which those solutions become forthcoming. So then people start looking for, damn it, we need a solution now. Let's make it easier. Let's just do this. And I just kind of, we mentioned the 30 Years' War before, but you could say, well, that was, you had different sects that were fighting over what is true that actually caused the 30 Years' War. But it's not actually that. It wasn't the 30 Years' War. These awful religious conflicts are not because there are different sects that are fighting. It's because each sect thinks that it needs to go to war in order to stamp the other sect out and like make its worldview dominant. So the secret sauce has been to secure individual liberty against such things up until this point. And now technology has leapt forward so much and changed the nature so much. And in fact, exposed the frauds, by the way, so much. Our old methods, let's just use the idea of expertise, right? So expertise is something every single person in the world, in principle, will agree somehow is important. I don't think there's anybody that would say that there's no such thing as expertise, or that somebody can be good at something or highly experienced, which is where the word expertise comes from, or become an expert in something, and that expertise matters. But the problem is that what expertise represents in practice is it's like a shortcut to validating whether or not somebody has done their due diligence. So if you tell me I can see on my map behind me, India, if you tell me you're an India expert, that you've studied India, you've done this and you've done that, and you know all about India, and I have reasons to believe, I'm like, well, prove it. And you're like, well, I did my PhD in India studies or whatever. And you pull out your PhD and you show me, and it's from a reputable university and all this. So you have a credential. I'm like, okay. And so you talk about India, and you're like, I go to India 3 times a year, whatever it is that you bring up. I worked with the parliament, XYZ, whatever. And then you show me all this, and I say, okay, so this guy knows what he's talking about India, so I'll listen to him, right? What actually all that stuff is a shortcut. The long road is you tell me all your opinions about India, then I go independently verify every single one of them before I decide if I listen to you or not. And only after I build up enough experience, okay, he gave me 1,000 statements. I checked 992 of them were right. So I can guess that over 99% of the time what he says about India is right. So I should just listen to him about India from now on. But that's a huge checking process. If you can show up and say, well, I have a PhD and I work with the parliament, and I say, good to go, I just trust you on India, I have 2 things to check, or maybe just 1. Do you really have your PhD? Did you really go? And now we're in business, right? And so it's a shortcut. But the problem is there's different ways to see it. One is that, expertise can be highly corrupted. Once you have something that certifies people, you can start gaming that system.
I mean, now we've gone real full circle back to the dilution of the value of higher education.
Yeah, well, of course. But on the other hand, there's been this big pulling back so there's been this kind of like, I want to think of it like, your shower probably has like the decorative curtain and then like the one that actually stops the water. So you got like 2 curtains. I want to think of it as like multiple curtains. We know, pull back the curtain and we'll see the truth. Well, we've pulled back the curtain on expertise and realized that there's a corruption problem in our expert class, and that there's been this kind of incestuous whatever morass that's allowed corruption in. But we've also pulled back the curtain and realized for the first time since the last major technological leap, which is the thing that's more parallel to, both of these are parallel to the Reformation, but we pull back the other curtain and realize that expertise is actually more limited than we thought it was. Like it used to be, if I saw your degree or whatever, and you said you were the India expert, then I'm like, he's our India guy. And we just listened to you about India. And you could have said the craziest stuff and nobody would have cared because you were the India guy. And now it's like, maybe you're a totally good faith actor, right? But there was just a limit. There's just so much and above that, you just don't know it, okay? Well, what we learned is that our experts were more limited than we assumed they were. They claimed to know more about disease or public health or economics or whatever than they actually did, even without the corruption there. So when people started to be able to do their own research, what you started to have is a ton of lay people prove a bunch of experts wrong in their own fields, which then collapsed the belief in the credential that is the shortcut method to whether or not you should believe that guy. So the answer to how we trusted or how we accepted as valid some offering of knowledge or information in the past basically got demolished on 2 fronts, both corruption and the fact that lay people could verifiably demonstrate and prove that the experts only knew however much they knew, and they got really important things wrong. Not sometimes, a lot. And so now we don't have that. Okay, so a big part of our liquidation problem is that the credentials that we used to respect, we don't respect anymore. And the credentials are the shortcut. And without the credentials, there's only one way to verify if somebody knows what they're talking about, which is the hard way, which is to check a large number of statements that they make and see if they pan out, which is virtually impossible to do. It's extraordinarily time and energy consuming to do. It's very hard to do well, even if you have the time and the energy to do it. It's very, very inefficient. And it's just faster to pick and simpler to pick other mechanisms, which boil down to he's on my political tribe. I like him. He looks like me. His family comes from the same part of the world as me. Whatever. These other heuristics come in as a replacement for this hollowed out credential. And you say people, I mean, we think of the Dave Smith, Douglas Murray debate, and Dave Smith saying his stuff. He said he learned it on the internet. Douglas Murray's like, have you been there? They all got mad. That's still like this thing, like having been to Israel or Gaza would provide you with information on the ground. Like, we all know about the Potemkin village, so we don't know if it's true. And so this whole idea that he just pulled the expert card and everybody didn't want to listen to him after that is indicative of, and so that debate itself is irrelevant. It's indicative of this fact that we used to have shortcuts to know when we should listen to somebody and when we shouldn't. And those shortcuts have been demolished. And frankly, there are long ways to do it, but we have neither the techniques or the inclination to engage in them. And this is when you end up with Candace Owens coming out and saying, I don't know, but I know. And people believing that is when all of those other things have been collapsed. So it's the same question you're still asking. I'm just pointing out various features of the landscape, which is that we don't know how to draw the lines of epistemic validity as to what we admit and what we exclude from the range of valid but not necessarily true pieces of information.
And in the process, I think what you're pointing to with Candace, it relates to why you've dubbed them the woke right, is that in lieu of tools to evaluate truth, and among those tools is what we used to have as shortcuts and experts and other useful heuristics, in lieu of all that, and in the face of the overwhelming information overload, the answer on the right and the left is to clamp down on identitarianism as the source for truth.
That helps,
moral and
but that's not what makes it woke. The other things that are not woke do that. So what makes it woke is actually something more specific. This has been my greatest frustration of the past 18 months, is realizing nobody knew what in the hell I've been talking about for 6 years as I tried to tell them what the word woke means. Gigantic multi-millions of people involved in an anti-woke movement. I think 100 of them know what the word woke even means, but they're against it. Don't worry. Woke epistemology, which is not to say the whole story, woke epistemology explicitly and in its own words openly, clearly describes what it is. It is a preference for marginalized perspectives, which includes that there's an intrinsic power analysis to how you decide what is true and what is not. That which has been systematically excluded from the conversation is more likely to be true than that which has not. That is their overriding heuristic for how they determine what is true and what is not.
Beyond the doubling down on identitarianism as the source of truth, it is the doubling down on marginalized identitarianism.
Correct. It's not even outsider knowledge, it's marginalized knowledge. It is that which the existing power structure does not want you to think or believe is more likely to be true than something inside the existing power structure.
Right, and that's reflected in Tucker and Candace's tone of grievance of being shunned by mainstream media. Here are the things that they won't tell you, or the things that I'm putting myself in danger for telling you.
That's right. Just asking questions. You're not allowed to say this.
What you're not allowed to say about Israel.
That's right. And on the left, it all invariably ends up getting located in identity, because identity is itself a powerful tribalizing tool. So what you'll say eventually is, well, here's a whole bunch of things that have been marginalized, and they're the, say, cultural experiences of gay people who live in gay enclaves, dealing with a straight society. So the identity politics latches onto this. And so straight society doesn't want to know what gay knowledges are about. So now gay knowledges have epistemic validity that has to be considered. And so gay knowledges becomes a heuristic for marginalized outsider knowledge, blah, blah, blah. So the identity politics comes in as a second step. But the woke picture is that there is what the existing power structure accepts as valid, and then there are things that it pushes out. And what we are in, because of this collapse in our trust of experts' credentials and the basic knowledge regime, the episteme that we all live in, is that there is an increasing preference for that which can be convincingly portrayed as having been marginalized knowledge. And that's what Candace and Tucker and Nick Fuentes, et cetera, are all trafficking in. It's not, I mean, this is what I used to say with stuff with the woke on the left, was that, you know, there are certain things people don't say because they're impolite, but there are other things people don't say because they're just not true, right? And so it's not, there's no marginal, there might be marginalization involved in saying something with racial overtones or whatever. There might even be true things like, let's say, the statistics around race and crime are true statements that one could make that it was considered impolite to say. They got attached to this idea of racism. On the other hand, we don't go around saying things like 2 + 2 = 5 because it's false, right? But if you start to say, well, the white hegemonic teaching structure wants us to believe that 2 + 2 = 4, and that benefits people who, will go along with that belief, and they're in the club, but people who want to explore other alternatives are therefore pushed out. Now, all of a sudden, you're mixing up exclusion of an idea because of its falsity and exclusion of an idea for an arbitrary political reason. And that is kind of the essence of the eventual mistake that the woke are always making. So, it's true to say that there are Jewish people who have been involved in shady stuff. It is, however, not true to then say the Jews are involved in shady stuff. And in fact, it's not just false, it's also impolitic in a rather extreme way, because that kind of rhetoric very quickly goes into dehumanizing rhetoric that not once, but many, many times in history has resulted in a society turning against its successful minority, and basically pogroms up to Holocaust as a result.
So, I mean, to end on a joyous note for Hanukkah, how is it that what's your explanation? What's your theory of the case as to why in this era of information diffusion, disestablishmentarianism, and epistemic anarchy that we're facing, and as us liberals trying to pick up the pieces and learn new tricks in order to survive, but why is it that in times like these, both the right and the left find common joy in hostility towards Jews?
So it was a Jewish inverted joke to go with the joyous part. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, the reasons, obviously Dennis Prager wrote a whole book called Why Jews to try to answer this question, and I think he did a pretty good job with it. But the answer is that you have a successful minority that tends not to fully assimilate. So when you actually, I think, see this dynamic is when what you have is a general trend. Well, there are two conditions under which you see this dynamic arise. One is that you have the existing people in power, like the Tsar in Russia before, I guess, late 19th century, wants to make a move, and they need a convenient scapegoat to do their political oppression, and then they can say, oh, the Jews are actually the ones that are doing the oppression. Then these things happen and people think it's the Jews that are doing it. So you see it when you have an illegitimate power structure wanting to blame a scapegoated minority in order to continue doing some kind of a power play in politics. So that's one condition, which maybe is sort of what's been happening with the Democrats and the left. I don't know. But the second condition is that you actually tend to see this when you start to have a significant downward mobility turn in society at large, when there's a constriction in society that cannot easily be blamed on some, and it might only be a perception of a constriction that cannot easily be blamed on some specific thing. Like, for example, in 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis was very blatantly the cause of the economic downturn. So you had a clear explanation for why there was downward mobility in the population all of a sudden. So it becomes very hard to start just blaming random scapegoats. But right now what we have is this perception, which is probably right, of downward mobility in terms of quality of life, expectation. We're making less money compared to how expensive it is. And that trend seems to be likely to continue for some period of time.
Not to mention that the sense of prospects is diminishing.
Correct. At those times, it becomes very easy to blame a successful minority. So I bring up that phrasing particularly because this is happening to Jews very specifically, but it's also happening to Indian immigrants who are outperforming whites in our country by a huge amount, right? So you have a small, successful minority who is now the interloper, who's basically stealing all the wealth. That's why there's downward contraction that otherwise doesn't have a clear and simple explanation. And that's not why they blame Jews, but that's like the timing of when that kind of occurs. But in this case, also South and to a degree, East Asian immigrants are also being, or descendants of immigrants are also being blamed for this downwardly mobile economic situation. I think the main reason, though, I think the two pieces that I just described are combined. I think that the Jew hate or the successful minority hatred almost always has to be stoked. And so to put it in kind of more plain language, I think there has to be a psyop attached to it that says some entity decides it's going to be profitable to take advantage of the crisis of downward mobility that people don't understand and blame a scapegoatable minority. And that will have to be a successful minority, more or less by definition.
Do you think that Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens' focus on the Jewish question and the Israel question, that's a psyop?
Yep, totally do. Absolutely think they are participating in an op. Absolutely do. No question.
You don't have a theory as to their sources?
I mean, there's a lot of guesses. We don't call him Tucker Carlson for no reason. Like, that meme stuck for some reason or another. And there are a lot of reasons to suspect it very well might be that he has connections to the Qataris. There are other reasons to suspect that he might have connections to Islamic countries more broadly. We certainly understand their motivations are typically pretty anti-Jewish. We also have very strong reasons to believe that the Russians are involved in a huge campaign to split America, and in particular the American conservative movement. And they know that the Israel question, to phrase it that way, would be a very potent tool to do that. We know that Tucker has connections in Russia. One does not merely interview Putin or get, completely overwhelmed by the glory of a Moscow train station and loaf of bread in a grocery store. That doesn't just happen. You don't accidentally mainline Alexander Dugin into American right-wing politics. Of all figures you could pick in the world, you don't accidentally do that. So connections to the Russian and the broad Islamic states, maybe specifically.
For people who don't know, Dugin is the Russian philosopher, maybe is the word. Is basically Putin's.
He gets called Putin's brain.
Putin's brain.
He's not. He's a weirdo.
Is Putin's Carl Schmitt, right?
Yeah. That's probably about right. Although I don't know how seriously Putin takes him. But the point is that he has been portrayed that way and is being popularized by a lot of figures on Tucker Carlson himself has done it. Aaron McIntyre at The Blaze has had him more than once. And there are others who have brought Alexander Dugin and his philosophy. Steve Bannon has actually found a video the other day somebody sent me of Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes in March of 2018 discussing the relevance of Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory to identitarian politics and the necessity of rising that on the right. So that's 2018, we're coming up on 8 years ago, March of 2018, that Nick Fuentes, as a very, very young looking man, 20 years old at the time, or 19 years old, talking to Richard Spencer, we're talking about Alexander Dugin. So Russia and the Islamic states are by far the best and easiest guesses, but that's pretty vague. I don't have evidence to make any such accusation, obviously, but I have no doubt that these operating with intent and with strategy to take control of and or damage the conservative movement.
Whatever the source is, it is fascinating how you can see it clearly crystallizing with the Jewish Israel fixation, but it applies on other fields. How the uppy right is converging with the left, and Hassan, what's his name? Hassan Piker embracing Nick Fuentes, or saying that he will happily embrace Nick Fuentes as well, on the same week as Tucker's interview with him. Israel and Jews seem to be, at least right now, a hinge point for this, but it is clearly something bigger. And how intentional or how backtrailing it is, I have no idea, but it is fascinating to watch. Again, morbidly fascinating.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot behind what's happening there. But I also urge people to realize, I think it's a cute coincidence that Israel as a state on the map is shaped like a wedge. And so it's like being driven like a wedge into the American body politic, both on left and right, by different vectors, right? Anti-Israel on the right, pro-Palestine on the left. You can say that those are two sides of the same coin, but there's certainly two different arguments that are being made in order to move the ball. And then there is this crossover. I don't know if it's quite convergence between the two as well, that like you brought up. It's not just Hassan Piker. You also have Cenk Uyghur and some of these other characters coming out and saying, I don't know what's going on with Tucker Carlson, but he's making a lot of sense. And I have videos of Candace Owens saying, it's a weird time. I find myself agreeing with characters on the left more than I do with characters on the right very often. So something is happening of that kind. And I've been convinced for a long time, this is how I got myself in trouble, that this is in fact a psyop. Its purpose is in fact to get us back on track with whatever I think the program was supposed to be pre-Trump, globally, politically. That program is probably the elevation of the Belt and Road Initiative for the CCP. It's a whole episode to try to unpack why I think that's relevant or how it's connected, but I think that that's the main driver. And the United States and its Constitution as a united entity remains its biggest obstacle to global dominance. But I think that there's more to the story than people losing their minds.
Right. Interesting. Well, this episode is going to be titled something like the epistemic drinking game, given how much we've used that word, and it defines our focus. We should have you back again for a geopolitical conversation. And either way, James, this was great. I'm going to leave you with our closer question. What do you could be quick, but what do you consider the worst blind spot on the left and the worst blind spot on the right now? The worst blind spot on, I'll restrict myself to the American left. I think the worst blind spot on, that's even hard because there's like two lefts, right? There's still a sane left that's not very sane. Its worst blind spot is Trump derangement syndrome. That was the answer I wanted to give. They think Trump is far worse of a character than he is, and it causes them to overlook how insane their left flank is. Of course, I think the blind spot for the left flank is reality itself, like that their stuff doesn't work. It's an ideological crackpot. On the right, kind of the mainstream right, just to break it down again, the worst blind spot there is they believe that this woke right phenomenon doesn't have any institutional power and is therefore largely irrelevant. So what they're missing is that its point is to shave enough people off of the coalition that elected Trump to undermine the Republican Party going forward. Its purpose is not to
march through the institutions and take over the country. It's to shave off enough people so that we end up with a lot of Democrats when we get back on the Democratic program. The blind spot on the far right is similar to the blind spot on the far left, is that there are a lot of earnest people on both far left and far right who believe the ideological Kool-Aid. So their blind spot is that they are useful idiots to an agenda that's using both of those extremes as like the blades in a pair of scissors. And so those would be kind of the four, if we broke politics into four pieces, what the four blind spots would be.
Well, this inevitably leads us to the geopolitical discussion, which I would love to have with you another time, but I've already taken 2 hours plus of your time, and I really appreciate it. James, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.